A grisly murder that is back in the headlines today. We're going to be talking about the Bedford Virginia murders and the house in the woods. We're going to do it with a little new twist. A twist that will capture your sleuth skills. This and more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals interviewed and participating in this show, and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster or Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello, and welcome to this another episode of Charlie Crimebuster. We welcome all of our listeners, especially new ones. We always like to invite everybody to reach out with a shout-out. You reach me, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Our episode today, it is a doozy for sure. I'm glad that we had the disclaimer. James Buckland, our producer, gave it because it is a horrible, horrible murder site. We'll be telling you all about that in just a few moments. By the way, if you'd like to support the program, we always appreciate that. You can go over to peacemakernetwork.com. That's peacemakernetwork.com. There you can become a badge, BADGE supporter for as little as $3 a month. And your support not only helps us maintain this podcast, it also helps us help the heroes, those that run to danger and into danger instead of away from danger. I'm talking about our wonderful law enforcement people, our first responder folks, and of course the brave men and women of military. By you becoming a badge supporter, you help us help them, and you help us with the podcast. Again, that's peacemakernetwork.com. If you'd like to get caught up on all the Charlie shows, and we got a bunch of them out there, then just go to Charlie Crimebuster at charliecrimebuster.com. Just charliecrimebuster.com, just that simple. Hit on the shows or episodes or Charlie shows, and you can see a whole group of shows that you might be interested in. Hey, by the way, for you folks that are so loyal and listen to us week by week, we appreciate it. We'd like to invite anybody out there to go to your platform and give us a 5-star rating. It always helps us to get more people involved in the program. More ratings we get, the better we are exposed out there in the media, online. So if you take time to give us a good rating, we would appreciate that. If you haven't followed the episode yet, hit follow. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. We'd love to have you as a part of the Charlie Crimebuster, well, we call it the Charlie Crimebuster train, as we discuss these terrible, terrible things that happen to people. All right, my friend, before we get into it, though, we always take time to share a crazy crook story. It kind of lightens the load, of some of the things we have to share. This one, oh, I laugh at them. I always think I've heard them all, but this one caught me a little bit surprised. An alleged drunk driver, he unwittingly, though, handed himself over to Nebraska police. He did that when he reported that someone else was traveling in the wrong direction. Turns out, though, he was the guy that was going in the wrong direction. It was a somewhat hilarious video. It was shared by the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office Thursday. Captured a bizarre incident that unfolded some time ago. The man told dispatchers that someone was driving a truck on the wrong side of Highway 77 in Lancaster County. Nearly ran him off the road. Though rattled by the close call, though, the drunk driver, he did give the officers clear coordinates of where the collision nearly happened. And, of course, along with that, perfect opportunity for them to hunt him down. You see, when the deputy pulled the man over just moments later, the driver immediately, then he realized what he'd done. And the officer said, "Hey, do you know why I stopped you?" "Yeah, because I was on the wrong side of the road." He said that he made that error because of a missed exit. Well, that driver was caught with a blood alcohol content, over twice the legal limit. And, of course, police arrested him, put him in the back of the patrol car. Now, the man who instantly confessed to calling 911 on himself, well, he did let the deputy know he was the one who called. He said, yeah, I thought someone was on the wrong side of the freaking road, bro. Yeah, because I was on the wrong side of the road, the man said. Now that driver again was called of over twice the limit, and he just went on, by the way, to let everybody know there at the scene that he was the guy. Well, he said, yep, I thought someone was on the wrong side of the road, but it turned out it was you, said the deputy. Yep, like a dumb, well, I'm not going to say it, truck driver admitted. And that, my friend, this crazy crook who thought that he was on the right side of the road when, in turn, he was on the wrong side of the road, called deputies to come to the rescue, and they did rescue him. They rescued him all the way to the slammer, the popo did, that is. And this, my friend, is Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. All right, we're going to tell you a story now that, is in the headlines again. They even got some specials out of it on some of the documentaries around. This is the Bedford County murders in Bedford, Virginia. And by the way, Bedford, Virginia is one of the places that I have visited. I've spent a lot of my time, in 3 states. Actually, a lot of time all over the place, but 3 states particularly that I've resided in: Virginia, Tennessee, and here in Florida. Now, in Virginia, the Bedford, well, it's resting at the foot of the Peaks of Otter, there in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, only about 9 miles away from the Parkway. And I got to tell you, folks, boy, there's some of the most beautiful scenery in the entire world is found right there in central Virginia, moderate climate. And the town has several historic landmarks. National D-Day Memorial. I'm going to tell you a little more about that in a moment. The Elks National Home and visitors, well, they have a wide range of attractions. Thomas Jefferson's popular forests. And, of course, the beautiful, beautiful Smith Mountain Lake. And along with the Blue Ridge Parkway and the Peaks of Otter, well, there's just a few dozen wineries within a short drive out of the town. Plenty of antiques. There's horseback riding, hunting, fishing, other outdoor sports. And according to the Chamber of Commerce, it makes the town of Bedford the perfect home base for anyone. Now, I did mention that Bedford is the home of the National D-Day Memorial. Now, despite the fact that National was in the title, that memorial is actually owned and operated by a nonprofit foundation. And the United States Congress, they warranted that memorial, and hang on to this because this is going to come back into the story, believe it or not. They warranted that memorial would be the nation's D-Day Memorial. President Bill Clinton authorized the effort in September 1996. And then President George W. Bush, he dedicated the memorial as the nation's D-Day Memorial on June the 6th, 2001. Now, there's a reason for that. And here it is. Bedford, my friend, lost more residents per capita in the Normandy landings than any other American community. Yep, 19 of 34 Virginia National Guard soldiers from Bedford. They were in Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. They were killed on D-Day. 3 other Bedford soldiers died later in the Normandy campaign. And with a 1944 population of about 3,200, well, this community in Bedford, it suffered the nation's most severe D-Day losses. And so that's why that D-Day Memorial is so important to the people there in Bedford. Now remember, we were fighting who? The Germans. Hang on to that. It has something to do with the case that we're going to be telling you about in this series. And if you're into true crime, then your own recollection of this area, it might go back to around April of 1995, March and April, when the discovery of 2 bodies stabbed to death with over 30 stab wounds in an almost severed head. Yep, we're talking about the murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom. Nancy, let me tell you a little bit about that. We always try to take a little time to tell you about the victims of these crimes, that they're real people. Nancy, she was born in Arizona, but boy, her heart was in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And like her mother, she spent the final chapters of her life there. She had a failed marriage. It produced 2 sons. And Nancy's second marriage to Derek Haysom, well, that looked like it was lasting. Even though she was 19 years younger, Nancy instantly fell in love with Derek Haysom. He was a fellow divorcee with 4 children. He was born in South Africa to British parents, and he did earn a very nice living as an engineer. Now, after Derek and Nancy, they married in 1960, they added one more person to their group. It was a daughter by the name of Elizabeth Roxanne Haysom. Remember that name. Now, while they lived in several countries before settling down to Virginia, Elizabeth would attend a British prep school of Abbey to complete her middle and high school education. Now, Elizabeth was described as highly intelligent during her time there at Abbey. She had a great deal of academic ambition. And she also, as a lot of teenage girls, had a penchant for drama. It turns out lots of drama on and off stage. In fact, I guess you could say, as a lot of teenage girls, she really lived a rather spoiled life. Maybe now there are accusations, though, that she had been abused. Well, maybe not. Did she? Was she? It's a crazy story. I'm going to let you decide. From the time she was born in South Africa, Elizabeth was a child. She did demand a lot of attention. She was 10 years younger than her closest sibling. And wanting their daughter to have the best education possible, well, they enrolled her in Wycombe Abbey, a boarding school about an hour northwest of London. Now, at first, as kids often do, Elizabeth had a little trouble fitting in, but after a couple of years, she learned the traditions, and she became a lot more accepted among her peers. She had some semblance of a social life, but she also maintained a strict regimen of schoolwork. That was even in addition to her music and acting activities. In the last years of her schooling, well, Derek and Nancy enrolled Elizabeth in a very high-level science and mathematics class. And they were hoping, as a lot of parents are, they were hoping that she would follow her father's path into an engineering career. Yet Elizabeth, she seemed to kind of bend more toward the artistic courses. And because she wasn't very happy in that environment of an engineer future, her grades, well, they went down instead of up. She was forced to attend high school for actually an additional year. Now, there are those who study this case say that was the time when Elizabeth began to resent her parents. And she did like a lot of teenagers. She began to rebel against them. One of the first incidents, well, it was a situation where Elizabeth claimed she was framed. That was after a few girls there at Abbey was caught with drugs. Elizabeth, she said they blamed her because they knew school officials would believe the quote-unquote foreign girl did it. As part of her punishment, well, she was prohibited from using the telephone. Well, it kind of kept her out of touch of her parents for several days. She later claimed that this was what led to her running away from the school. And she was away, get this, for almost 5 months. And when she returned, a lot of her friends had moved on. And then Elizabeth, she was even more resistant to some of the things that was taking place in her life. And she began to think about all the ways that her parents had done her wrong. There was even a perceived injustice where she claimed she was raped at the age of 10 while attending school in Switzerland. She said her parents ignored the incident. She was also physically attacked by a teen boy at a school in Nova Scotia. She said because of her father's job there in South Africa and what was going on there with apartheid. Well, and unfortunately, it did appear that Elizabeth had the ability to exaggerate these things. The rape she claimed to suffer, well, it was just really a case of indecent exposure. And that physical assault, well, she claimed to have her 2 front teeth knocked out. Her face bashed against a brick wall. But it's pretty obviously that didn't happen because she still had her natural front teeth. Now, during her last year at Abbey, she began experimenting with drugs and her own sexuality. You see, in 1983, homosexuality was only beginning to be accepted in Europe, not according to the prep school rules. But Elizabeth began to claim that she was gay. She got expelled from Abbey. That meant she would not be accepted to her desired Trinity College. And then she got with a girlfriend, and they ran away again from July to October. They would go around to areas, and they'd take odd jobs. They would steal food, sleep in apartments and homes of strangers, sold their blood, and prostituted themselves as they traveled through France, Italy, and Germany. till finally, tired and broke, they asked for train tickets back to England. Now, when she was returned to her parents, that's when Derek, he was offered a job in Virginia. He and Nancy decided to be the best move for them all, maybe a new start. They would be hopeful that Elizabeth would be accepted by the University of Virginia. Elizabeth, she went along, but she was just there as more of a way to please her parents and thought that they were controlling her life. And she was very, very unhappy somewhat about that move to Virginia. Turns out that the move to this beautiful place in Virginia, beautiful mansion they had back in the woods, the house in the woods, well, it turned out that it was not really a good one for anybody with what happened on that terrible, fateful night. Now, it was reported back in 1981, Nancy and Derek had settled down there in upper-class Holcomb Rock Road at their home in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is right there in Bedford. It was essentially a mansion surrounded by open green lands. They were, of course, unaware they'd lose their lives right there 4 years later. The truth is, they made this move. They thought their retirement was, well, to get a little space from the hustle and bustle of all the cities. And they would still have establishments to go to and the country clubs, of course, to fool around in. It was crucial for the 53 and 72-year-olds. They were socialites. But it all crumbled apart on that fateful 1985 evening. I think I said 95 earlier in the podcast, but it was 85. I misspoke. Now, according to the reports, Nancy and Derek were found nearly decapitated inside their affluent house on April 3rd. Yet, get this, there were no signs of forced entry or robbery. Kind of made investigators think they knew their killers. There were other details as well as pieces of evidence suggesting how this crime scene, well, it practically expanded the entire space, made this case just infamous. The married couples were attacked, according to police records, while they were sitting at their dining table, enjoying dinner, dessert, glass of wine. Seemed like that Derek was the first one to get struck. Investigators said it was actually like a slaughterhouse, because not only was Derek's throat slashed ear to ear, he was also stabbed around 36 times. Then, Nancy, she was stabbed as she was running away. She somehow managed to cross the dining area as well as the living area. She was actually in the kitchen trying to make it to the back door when her throat was slashed from behind. Blood was everywhere. Through these horrific facts, my friend, there were even signs of satanic rituals on blood-stained floors. Now, it did appear that whoever did this had showered before leaving, and the bodies were dragged around a little bit. Now, the satanic killing theory, it had some legs on it, because at the state police investigators who were enlisted to help the investigators locally there, they viewed the crime scene photos and they thought there was real reason to believe that this was a satanic killing. Remember now, this was not that many years away from the horrible mansion killings in Helter Skelter. Oh, there were other suspects as well. Some of the first suspects that were examined by investigators, well, there was a girlfriend of one of the sons, a person of interest. Spurned girlfriend who was angry. Then there was the gardener. You often hear about the gardeners in these types of killings, don't you? Well, this gardener, he had been fired, and he wasn't very happy about it. But on top of that, now get that, on top of that, he had a criminal record. He was a person of interest. And then, of course, Derek, through all of his dealings, he had made some enemies along the way. Even back there in South Africa, there were those that didn't have good feelings about Derek. So was this some maybe terroristic killing? A lot of things for investigators to think about. And as always, investigators, they do have to take a close look at family members. One was Elizabeth's sister. She, of course, had some problems in her life, and they thought maybe she had something to do with it. Then they begin, of course, to zero in on the family, and then before long, they begin to look at Elizabeth. Remember Elizabeth? The rebellious daughter, that rebellious daughter? Remember her? Well, they wanted to take a look at her. Well, what happened to Elizabeth during all this time? Well, in 1984, she did. She enrolled in the University of Virginia. She was a scholar-type student. She had some things going for her with her good grades. Like her early days at Abbey, though, she still had trouble fitting in with her schoolmates. And then she met a guy by the name of Jens Soering. He was a German-born 18-year-old. He was the son of a diplomat. Now, remember I said German-born. He was described as small and squirrely. Now, Jens was off-putting to a lot of students because of his arrogance and his support of Nazi Germany. Now, at first, Elizabeth, she thought Jens was wimpy. But the more she talked to him, the more she learned they really had a lot in common. They liked to write. They liked the arts. But they also liked the snootiness toward Americans and the resentment of their families. And during that time, Elizabeth, she spent hours talking to Jens about how she was assaulted and her parents' indifference about it, that she was raped. They didn't even seem to care about it. Sent her overseas to school instead of dealing with it. She told him about how, in fact, she had ran away a couple times. Now, Jens, well, he had his story, too. He told Elizabeth about his wealthy grandmother, who had refused to give his own mother money to divorce his strict father, money which he believed that he and his mother were rightfully entitled to. Then, my friend, Jens was appalled when Elizabeth told him that Nancy, her own mother, forced her to strip and assume strange poses while she photographed her. She was suggesting that she had been sexually abused by her own mom. Now, according to Elizabeth, it wasn't the first time she had been, quote, unquote, used by her mother. Jens asked her how she was able to live with that kind of abuse. And she said, well, she just learned to cope. Now, if Jens didn't have good feelings about the parents, well, equally, her parents didn't have good feelings about him. In fact, Derek and Nancy, they did not like Jens from the moment they laid eyes on him. They thought he was arrogant, cynical. Jens seemed to fuel on Elizabeth's dramatics and exaggerations. They didn't like that. They really didn't hide their feelings from Elizabeth, bluntly told her that they did not like Jens. They encouraged her to meet other boys, consider other fish in the sea. But as you know, when parents begin to double down, children begin to double down as well. And she said she loved Jens, and that's who she wanted to be with. There was no one else in her mind. And boy, she didn't keep her parents' feelings as a secret from Jens. She was angry that her parents tried to control every aspect of her life and her love life. And every time she brought it up, according to her, well, Jens, he was even more angry. Now, my friend, I want to take a moment. I want to tell you a side of this story, but I want you to remember this is only one side of the story. And as we know, there's usually two sides to a story. Well, my friend, there are more than two sides of this story, so hang on to your hat. We're in for a ride on this mystery. So keep in mind, this is only one side of the story. This is what Elizabeth said happened. On March the 30th, you see, Elizabeth and Jens, according to her, she had it all worked out. They're going to rent a car. They're going to go to Washington, D.C. They get a hotel room. Elizabeth would go to the movies, buying 2 tickets to the movies. There's a reason for that. While Jens, he went to her parents' home. According to her, he had a heart-to-heart with them. So March the 30th, 1985, according to her, they set that plan in action. After 8 o'clock that evening, there came a knock on the door there at the mansion. The mansion even had a name, by the way. It was called the Loose Chippings. Loose Chippings, that's what Nancy had given to their home. So as a knock on the door, Derek and Nancy, they wondered who could have come calling at that hour of the night. And on their doorstep, well, there was Jens, Elizabeth's boyfriend. They asked her where Elizabeth was. He said, well, he just came alone, wanted to talk to him. They were hesitant, but they invited him in. They offered him food and drink there while they talked. Jens later said that Derek spent much of the time outlining their hopes and dreams for Elizabeth and how Jens was simply just not a part of that plan. Derek bluntly, according to the story, told Jens that if he insisted on seeing his daughter, he would do everything he could to get Jens dismissed from the university. Well, Jens, he was offended. He abruptly stood up from his chair. Derek also rose from his seat. He told Jens, "Sit down, young man," but Jens, he wasn't going to have any of it. Instead, according to this story that Elizabeth was telling others, Jens pulled a knife from his pocket, slashed at Derek, cutting him deep in the neck. Nancy, she saw the attack on her husband. She ran for the phone to call for help. Then Jens brutally ran after her, attacked her, stabbed her several times, leaving her to bleed to death on the kitchen floor. Then he returned to Derek. Jens found his girlfriend's father back on his feet, ready to defend himself. They just struggled. There was a fight. Jens intending to finish what he started. Of course, Derek, I guess he was just trying to live, survive. Well, when it was all said and done, Derek lay in a pool of blood on the living room floor. He and Nancy had been slashed so viciously they were nearly decapitated. After spending several minutes cleaning himself, pacing back and forth, he tried to come to terms of what he had done. Well, decided to head back to D.C. Elizabeth, meanwhile in D.C., she was tired of waiting for him to return. Instead of watching a third movie, she went to the hotel. That's where Jens found her. That's when Jens found her. She said he was wrapped with a sheet. Now, at first, when these bodies were discovered several days later, well, the citizens, the police of all the area, well, they were afraid that Haysom's murders was the work of a crazed madman, satanic cult. They had no known enemies, though. Didn't appear to have been robbed. So when they began to talk to Elizabeth about her German boyfriend that might be weird, but being weird didn't make him a murderer. Initially, Elizabeth, when she was finally faced with the police several months later, kind of zeroing on her, she said she was at a showing of the Rocky Horror Picture Show at the time of her parents' murder. They were up there just having a weekend alone there at the motel room, watching movies. And Jens, he said, yep, that's what we did. He supported that by saying we even had hotel room service. We got receipts from the night of the murder. We got the movie tickets. But now, hang on. When investigators looked at the rental car that they got, that agreement, they found something that stood out. Total mileage, 669 miles. Now, these two lovebirds, if they'd only gone from the University of Virginia to the Washington, D.C. area, that trip would have been about 240 miles. But on the other hand, if they had driven from Washington back to Charlottesville, then back to D.C., and back again, well, if they put in the fact that they left Washington, did the murder, returned back, that was approximately 669 miles. In other words, the miles just did not add up to the alibi, but the miles did add up to the possibility that they were involved in the murder of her parents. So, my friend, realizing that the police was closing in on them, Elizabeth and Jens, they took off to England. There they lived under assumed names. It just looked like these murders had just taken right out of America, disappeared into the thin air. But remember, they loved to spend money. That's how they lived. Their parents made that happen for them. But now they did not have their parents' money to afford them, so they came up with a plan. They would write checks and kite them. They'd write checks for all kinds of things, and then they would return them and get the money. And that was working for a while until they were spotted at a department store in the Richmond area of London, making exchanges for cash, writing checks for new purchases, even pretending they did not know one another. But that store security officer was suspicious enough to follow them. Police got involved, and they were arrested. And then when they were arrested and they searched their apartment, they found multiple IDs and they found some letters, some incriminating letters. Then they contacted detectives back into their home area, and then they were all keyed in on the fact that her parents had been murdered. Detectives then went all the way to London to talk to these two. And what happens next will completely blow your mind. That's going to be part 2 of this series that we're doing now on the Bedford murders, the house in the woods. And my friend, you may think you have this all figured out. You may think that what I shared with you when I shared with you Elizabeth's story, that this happened, that's exactly how it happened. I'm here to tell you, you are in for an awakening. This is a case that has twists and turns that will completely blow your mind. Even to this point, early on in my research of this case, I just wasn't sure who done it. We're going to let you decide who done it, and we're going to talk about the murders in Bedford, a house in the woods, part 2, next time. But until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert for the life you save. It could be your very own.